In the spring of 2019, a researcher named Sarah Mitchell was cataloging misfiled documents in Box 847 of the National Archives when she found 47 letters that would rewrite our understanding of how World War II ended. They were written in German on Wehrmacht stationery between April 16th and April 30th, 1945. The handwriting was precise, the ink faded to brown, the pages brittle at the edges. Each letter began the same way. Dear Martin, each letter was unsigned, and none of them had ever been sent. The author was Major Klaus Weber, age 32, a staff officer assigned to Field Marshal Ernst von Stein, chief of the German Armed Forces High Command. The recipient was his younger brother, Corporal Martin Weber, age 24, serving somewhere in the collapsing defenses around Berlin. What made these letters extraordinary was not the information they contained, the facts they documented, the events they described, the conversations they recorded had long been known to historians. Testimonies existed. Official records survived. The timeline was established. What made them extraordinary was that Klaus Weber had written them in real time, not as retrospective memoir, not as courtroom testimony, but as events unfolded, hour by hour, in the concrete tomb beneath the Reich Chancellery, where the final decisions of the Third Reich were made. This is not history rewritten. This is history written down as it happened, by a man who did not know he was witnessing one of the great ironies of the 20th century. These are the Weber letters, April 16th, 1945, 4:30 in the morning. The first letter began without preamble, written by flashlight in a basement corridor while the building above shook from distant artillery. Martin, if you are reading this, it means I survived long enough to send it, or someone found it after I did not. Either way, you need to know what is happening here. Not the propaganda, not the official reports, the truth. The Silo Heights are under attack. Marshal Zhukov's forces began the assault 2 hours ago, just before dawn. I know this because I delivered the intelligence report to the field marshal at 0400 hours. 2 million Soviet soldiers, 6,000 tanks, 40,000 artillery pieces. General Muller commands perhaps 100,000 men, most of them rear echelon personnel, police battalions, and boys from the Hitler Youth who barely know how to aim their rifles. The field marshal studied the map for 3 minutes without speaking. His hands did not shake. When he finally looked up, he said only, "Inform the Führer that General Muller will hold the line." Then he dismissed me. Martin, I do not think General Muller can hold the line. I do not think anyone could hold that line. But I am a major, and majors do not contradict field marshals, so I said nothing. Above us, the city is burning. Down here, we move colored pins across maps and pretend the pins represent divisions that still exist. I think about you, somewhere out there with the Ninth Army. I think about what happens when the pins no longer match reality. I think the war will end in weeks, maybe days. I am writing this because if it ends badly, someone should know what happened in these rooms. Someone should know that we knew. And we said nothing. Stay alive, Martin. Move west if you can. The Americans are better than what is coming from the east. Your brother, Klaus. Major Klaus Weber folded the letter, placed it in an envelope, and tucked it into his tunic pocket. There was no way to send it. The postal system had collapsed weeks ago, but writing it made him feel less alone in the underground warren of concrete and diesel fumes, where he now spent 20 hours a day. He picked up his notebook and flashlight and climbed the 18 stairs to the upper bunker level. The generators hummed, their rhythm constant as a heartbeat in the artificial world beneath Berlin. The ventilation system cycled stale air that smelled of mold and unwashed bodies. Somewhere above, the real war was being fought by exhausted men in foxholes. Down here, the war was fought with maps and radio messages and orders issued to formations that existed mainly on paper. Weber was a tall man, thin from months of reduced rations, with dark hair graying prematurely at the temples. He had survived the Russian front, the retreat from Ukraine, and the chaos of the final months because he was competent, quiet, and useful. Staff officers who were competent and quiet tended to survive longer than those who offered opinions. He had learned not to offer opinions, but he still had eyes. And what he had seen in the past 3 months had convinced him that the men who commanded Germany's armed forces were either delusional or lying to themselves so thoroughly that the difference no longer mattered. He found Field Marshal von Stein in the map room, bent over a table covered with topographical charts. The field marshal was 63, gray-haired, impeccably uniformed, even in a bunker 50 feet underground. He had been a professional soldier for 40 years, a careful man who understood logistics and defensive operations. He had also been a loyal servant of the regime for 12 years, and loyalty had required him to suppress the careful instincts that had once defined his career. "The latest from General Miller," Weber said, placing a typed report on the table. Von Stein read it without expression. The report stated that Soviet forces had achieved a breakthrough on the northern sector of the Silo Heights. 3 defensive positions overrun, casualties heavy, ammunition critical, no reserves available. "Inform Colonel General Fischer," von Stein said. "Tell him I will brief the Führer at show 600 hours. "Yes, sir." Weber turned to leave. Von Stein's voice stopped him. "Major." "Sir? Your brother is with the Ninth Army, correct?" Weber felt his chest tighten. "Yes, sir. The Ninth Army is ordered to hold its position and prepare to attack north into Zhukov's flank. The Führer believes this will relieve pressure on the heights." Weber said nothing. The Ninth Army was encircled, undersupplied, and fighting for its survival. An attack into Zhukov's flank was not a military operation. It was a fantasy. "I understand, sir." Von Stein looked at him for a moment. Something passed across the field marshal's face. Fatigue, perhaps, or recognition that they both knew the truth and could not speak it. "Dismissed." Weber climbed back down to the lower level. He found an empty corner near the storage rooms, pulled out the envelope, and added a postscript. "Martin, they have ordered the Ninth Army to attack north. Do not do it. If you get the order, ignore it. Desert if you must. Move west. The Americans will take prisoners. The Soviets will not be so kind. Please, Martin. Live." He folded the letter again and returned it to his pocket. What Weber did not know, what he could not know as he wrote those desperate words in the bunker's dim light, was that 300 miles to the east his brother was already beyond any orders, beyond any hope of reading warnings written in underground corridors. Corporal Martin Weber had been killed 6 hours earlier when a Soviet tank shell struck his position during the initial bombardment of defensive lines south of Berlin. His body lay in a crater with 11 other men from his company. None of them would be identified. None of them would be buried, but Klaus Weber would not learn this for another 10 days. Until then, he would write 15 more letters to his brother, documenting the collapse of the Reich and the conversations that would determine how quickly that collapse became complete. The Soviet assault on the Silo Heights employed a tactic that was both brilliant and terrifying. At precisely 500 hours on April 16th, Marshal Zhukov ordered 143 searchlights aimed at the German positions. The darkness flooded with white light. Defenders, dug into trenches and reinforced bunkers along the ridgeline, were suddenly exposed, silhouetted, blinded. Then came the artillery. 40,000 tubes opened fire simultaneously. The barrage lasted 30 minutes. The heights, a natural ridge rising 100 meters above the Oder River plain, became a landscape of craters and shattered concrete. Trees were reduced to splinters. Buildings vanished. The earth itself seemed to convulse. When the barrage lifted, the tanks came. T-34s by the hundreds, advancing in waves, supported by infantry in greatcoats and fur hats. Men who had fought from Stalingrad to Warsaw, and who understood that Berlin lay 30 miles ahead, and victory was measured in miles gained per hour, not per day. General Miller's troops fought with the desperation of men who understood what they were defending. Every hour the heights held meant another hour for civilians to flee westward, away from the Soviet advance. Teenage boys with Panzerfaust launchers crouched in basements and foxholes, waiting until the tanks rolled within 30 meters before firing single-shot weapons that often exploded in their faces. German anti-tank teams destroyed hundreds of Soviet vehicles in brutal close-range engagements amid the rubble. For 3 days they held. Weber chronicled it all in letters he could not send. April 17th, morning. The heights still hold, but barely. Müller reports ammunition running low. The Führer has ordered the Luftwaffe to provide air support. We have perhaps 20 operational aircraft in the entire sector. The Soviets have thousands. The order is madness, but no one says this aloud. I delivered casualty reports this morning. 17,000 Germans dead or wounded in 24 hours. The field marshal read the numbers, nodded, and moved pins on his map as though moving pins could summon reinforcements that do not exist. Martin, I do not know if you are alive. I do not know if this letter will ever reach you, but I need to write it because down here, surrounded by men who lie to themselves every hour, I need to tell someone the truth. We are losing, not slowly, not gradually, catastrophically, and the men in this bunker either do not see it or refuse to admit what they see. April 18th brought no relief. Soviet forces accepting horrific casualties pushed forward despite losses. Zhukov, racing to reach Berlin before his rival Marshal Konev could claim the prize, ordered continuous assault. His soldiers attacked in shifts, giving defenders no rest, no time to regroup. German positions began to collapse, not all at once, not in panic, but in the slow erosion of units that had fought beyond exhaustion, beyond hope, until ammunition ran out and there was nothing left to do but surrender or die. Weber's letter that evening was brief. April 18th. The end approaches. Not in weeks. In days. Maybe hours. The heights cannot hold much longer. When they fall, nothing stands between Zhukov and Berlin. 70 kilometers of open ground. His tanks will cover that distance in 2 days. Martin, I pray you are not there when they arrive. On the morning of April 19th, the Silo Heights fell. Soviet forces poured through the breach, columns of armor and motorized infantry racing westward with orders to encircle Berlin before American forces could arrive from the opposite direction. In the bunker, Weber delivered the report to Field Marshal von Stein. The Field Marshal read it, set it down, and stared at the map for 5 full minutes without speaking. Finally, he said, "Inform the Führer. The eastern defense has collapsed. Soviet forces will reach the outskirts of Berlin within 48 hours. Weber climbed to the upper level and found Colonel General Otto Fischer, Chief of Operations. Fischer was 55, shorter than Weber, with steel-gray hair and the careful eyes of a man who had spent his career managing crises he did not create. He read the report and exhaled slowly. The Führer will want to know about relief operations. There are no relief operations, sir. I know that, Major. But the Führer does not know that, or he knows and does not accept it. The distinction has become meaningless." Fischer walked to the map and traced the Soviet positions with one finger. Red arrows converging from 3 directions, the encirclement forming, Berlin in the center. "How much time?" Weber asked. "For what?" "For decisions." Fischer looked at him. "Decisions were made months ago, Major. We are simply living with the consequences." That night, Weber wrote his longest letter yet. April 19th. The heights have fallen. Martin, if you were there, I hope you were not. I hope you moved west. I hope you reached American lines. I hope you are in a prisoner of war camp eating Red Cross rations and wondering when you will go home. I hope these things because the alternative is unbearable. Today I watched Field Marshal von Stein inform the Führer that our last natural defensive barrier has been breached. The Führer listened, said nothing, and then ordered General Steiner to launch a massive counteroffensive from the north. Steiner commands perhaps 5,000 exhausted men with no tanks and little ammunition. The order is for him to attack south with divisions that exist only on paper. I saw Colonel General Fischer's face when the order was given. He said nothing. None of us said anything. We have trained ourselves so thoroughly to obey that even when obedience means disaster, we cannot find the words to object. Tonight I lie in my bunk and think about something Father used to say. A soldier obeys orders, but a man knows when orders are wrong. I think Father would be ashamed of us, all of us. We are soldiers who forgot how to be men. Forgive me, Martin. I am tired. I am watching something terrible unfold and I do not have the courage to stop it. None of us do. Weber folded the letter and placed it with the others in his footlocker. 16 letters to a brother who might already be dead, written by a man who was beginning to suspect that survival was not about courage or skill, but simple random chance in a war that had consumed all meaning except the basic mathematics of death. April 20th, 1945. Adolf Hitler's 56th birthday. In better times, the occasion would have been marked by elaborate ceremonies, parades, speeches broadcast across Germany and occupied territories. In April 1945, it was marked by a subdued gathering in the bunker's conference room, attended by senior figures who understood they might never see another such occasion. Weber stood in the corridor outside, responsible for ushering visitors and maintaining the schedule. He watched them arrive one by one, descending the 18 stairs from the upper bunker into the stale air below. Reich Marshal Hermann Göring arrived first, overweight and overdressed, his once considerable power eroded by the Luftwaffe's catastrophic failures. He moved with the careful calculation of a man positioning himself for the endgame, eyes scanning the room, assessing who held influence and who did not. Reichsfuhrer Heinrich Himmler came next, thin and cold behind wire-rimmed spectacles, commander of the SS and secret architect of genocide. He carried a leather briefcase and spoke to no one. Weber knew from intercepted communications that Himmler was pursuing unauthorized negotiations with Western allies through intermediaries, seeking a separate peace that would preserve his own life and perhaps position him as Hitler's successor. Propaganda Minister Joseph Goebbels arrived with his wife Magda, a rare public appearance for a woman whose presence in the bunker signaled the family's commitment to share the Führer's fate, whatever that fate might be. Goebbels was small, limping from his clubfoot, fanatic in his loyalty, even as the regime he had served for 12 years collapsed into rubble and ash. Albert Speer, the Reich's armaments minister, came last. Tall, young for his position, architect turned administrator, who had recently defied direct orders to implement scorched earth destruction of German infrastructure. He moved quietly, observed carefully, and said little. Weber respected him for this. Field Marshal von Stein and Colonel General Fischer were already present, standing near the map table, reviewing overnight intelligence reports. Weber was not invited to the gathering itself, but he stood close enough to hear through the partially open door. Hitler's voice, when he spoke, was quieter than the bombastic recordings that had filled stadiums in years past. The tremor in his hands had spread to his voice. Parkinson's disease, or stress, or both. The conversation was subdued. Perfunctory congratulations. Vague discussions of military situations. No one mentioned that Soviet artillery had begun landing in the eastern suburbs that morning. No one mentioned that the ring was tightening hourly. Then Göring spoke, his voice carrying through the door. Mein Führer, with the situation in Berlin growing critical, perhaps it would be prudent to consider relocating command to a more secure position. The Berghof in Bavaria remains under our control. From there, we could establish a government in exile, coordinate the remaining southern armies, continue the fight from a position of strategic advantage. Silence followed. Weber, standing in the corridor, felt his pulse quicken. It was the first time in months that anyone had suggested, however obliquely, that the Führer should leave Berlin. Himmler's voice came next, smooth and careful. The Reich Marshal raises a valid strategic concern. Operational flexibility requires the preservation of command authority. If that authority is compromised, coordination becomes impossible. More silence. Then Hitler's response, vague and non-committal. There are other considerations. General Wenck's 12th Army is moving north from the Harz Mountains. Steiner's offensive from the north. Relief operations are underway. Berlin will hold. I have full confidence in our defensive positions. Weber closed his eyes. General Wenck's 12th Army was 80 miles away, undersupplied, and primarily concerned with holding open escape corridors to the west, not attacking toward Berlin. Steiner's offensive was a phantom, a collection of shattered units that could not attack because they did not exist in sufficient numbers to mount any operation beyond basic survival. The Führer was describing military operations that would not happen, and everyone in that room knew it. The gathering broke up an hour later. Göring emerged first, moving quickly toward the stairs. Himmler followed, cold eyes fixed ahead. They were leaving Berlin. Tonight or tomorrow, they would depart for their respective headquarters in Bavaria and northern Germany, abandoning the capital under the pretense of operational necessity. Weber understood what he was witnessing. The rats were leaving the ship, but two men were not leaving. Von Stein and Fischer remained in the conference room after the others had gone, standing at the map table, speaking in low voices. Weber, still in the corridor, moved closer to the partially open door. "They are fleeing," Fischer said. "Goering to Bavaria, Himmler to the north, both positioning themselves as potential successors." "And we remain," von Stein replied. "Someone must." "Must what? Witness the end? 300,000 soldiers and civilians will be trapped in this city when the Soviets complete their encirclement. For what purpose? To defend a regime that is already lost?" Fischer's voice dropped to barely a whisper. "Then what do you propose?" Von Stein did not answer immediately. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of words he had never allowed himself to say aloud. "Someone must tell him the truth. He has been told the truth. He does not accept it. Then someone must tell him differently, not as strategic assessment, not as casualty figures, as a choice. Stay and die, or leave and preserve something. If we suggest he leave, we will be shot for defeatism. If we say nothing, everyone dies." Weber, listening from the corridor, felt something shift inside his chest. For 12 years, these men had been perfect soldiers, executing orders without question, subordinating personal judgment to institutional loyalty. And now, in a bunker beneath a burning city, they were discussing the unthinkable. They were going to tell Adolf Hitler to run. Fischer's voice again, quieter now. "Who will make the proposal?" "We will, together. After the military situation deteriorates beyond any possibility of denial." "It has already deteriorated beyond any possibility of denial." "I mean when he cannot deny it. When Steiner's offensive fails, when the Ninth Army is confirmed destroyed, when Soviet forces complete the encirclement, then we speak. And if he refuses, then at least we tried. Someone must be able to say we tried." Footsteps approached the door. Weber stepped back quickly, moving down the corridor as though he had just arrived. Von Stein emerged, saw Weber, and stopped. "Major." "Sir." "You heard?" Weber considered lying, decided against it. "Yes, sir." Von Stein studied him for a long moment. "Tomorrow or the next day, Colonel General Fischer and I will make a proposal to the Führer, a proposal that could result in our immediate execution. You will be present as a witness. If we do not survive, someone must remember that we tried." "I understand, sir." "Do you?" Von Stein's voice was harsh. "Do you understand that we are 12 years too late? That we should have spoken in 1933, or 1939, or 1941, but we said nothing because we were cowards wrapped in the fiction of duty?" Weber had no answer. Von Stein's voice softened. "Your brother is with the Ninth Army. I am sorry. The latest intelligence suggests the Ninth has been encircled near Halbe. Casualties are catastrophic. Few will escape." The world tilted. Weber's vision narrowed. He forced himself to breathe. "Thank you for informing me, sir." Von Stein placed one hand on Weber's shoulder. "Write your letters, Major. Document what happens here. If this all ends badly, someone must know we tried. Not enough, but we tried." He walked away, climbing the stairs to the upper level, leaving Weber alone in the corridor with the knowledge that his brother was almost certainly dead, and the men who commanded Germany's armed forces were finally, belatedly, catastrophically, considering telling their Führer a truth he would not accept. That night, Weber wrote 2 letters. The first was to Martin. April 20th. "Your unit has been encircled. I do not know if you are alive. I do not know if you escaped. I will write anyway, because the alternative is to accept that you are gone, and I am not ready to accept that. Tomorrow or the next day, Field Marshal von Stein and Colonel General Fischer will tell the Führer something no one has dared to say. They will tell him to leave Berlin, to save himself and perhaps save the 300,000 souls who will be trapped here when the Soviets close the ring. I do not know if he will listen. I suspect he will not, but they will try. I will be there when they do, not as participant, as witness. Someone must remember that in the end, when it was too late to matter, Germany's senior commanders finally found the courage to tell the truth. Martin, if you are alive, move west. If you are dead, forgive me for not finding the courage sooner. Forgive all of us." The second letter was different, not addressed to Martin, not addressed to anyone, just words on paper written because speaking them aloud would be treason. I am watching men who have spent 12 years obeying orders they knew were wrong finally consider disobedience. I am watching professional soldiers rediscover the humanity they surrendered when they chose loyalty over conscience. It is too late. It has been too late since 1939, perhaps since 1933. But they are trying. Tomorrow I will witness something historians will debate for decades. The day Germany's top generals told their Führer to run. He will refuse. I know this as certainly as I know my brother is probably dead. He will refuse because his vanity will not permit escape. But the refusal will matter less than the offer. Because the offer proves that even at the end, even in a concrete tomb beneath a burning city, some men remember that orders are not enough, that obedience is not virtue. That there comes a moment when a soldier must become a man and say the thing that needs saying, regardless of consequence. I think my father would understand. I think he would forgive us for being 12 years too late. I do not know if I can forgive us. Weber folded both letters and placed them in his footlocker with the others. 19 letters now. A chronicle of collapse, written in real time by a man who did not know he was documenting one of history's great ironies. Outside, Soviet artillery continued to fall on the eastern suburbs. Inside, the generators hummed, and the ventilation system cycled stale air, and the men who had led Germany into catastrophe prepared to do the one thing they should have done years earlier. Tell the truth, even knowing it was too late, even knowing it would not matter, even knowing that sometimes the right thing happens not because good men find courage, but because evil men refuse the escape they are offered. Weber did not understand this yet. He would not understand it until the end, when the letters stopped and the final irony revealed itself. But on the night of April 20th, 1945, in a bunker beneath Berlin, he wrote the words that would be discovered 74 years later and would force historians to reconsider everything they thought they knew about how World War II ended. Not with heroes finding courage, but with villains refusing salvation. And in that refusal, accidentally, unintentionally saving more lives than any act of heroism could have saved. The story was not over. The worst was yet to come. But the path was set. The generals would speak. The Führer would refuse. And the war would end, not when good defeated evil, but when evil defeated itself. Weber climbed into his bunk and tried to sleep. Above him, the city burned. Below him, history waited. Tomorrow, the conversation would begin. April 21st, 1945. Morning. The Soviet artillery that had been systematically destroying the eastern defensive perimeter for 5 days now reached the city center. The first shells landed near the Brandenburg Gate at dawn. By mid-morning, the Tiergarten, once a fashionable park where Berliners strolled on Sunday afternoons, had become a killing ground crisscrossed by shell fire. Weber climbed to ground level through the emergency exit, carrying messages that needed hand delivery, because radio communications had become unreliable. The world above was unrecognizable. Buildings he had passed every day for months were now skeletal ruins. Fires burned unchecked. The smell of smoke and cordite and something worse, something organic, hung in the still air. He found a Hitler Youth unit manning a barricade constructed from an overturned tram and rubble dragged from collapsed apartments. They were children, 15, 16 years old. Some wore uniforms. Most wore civilian clothes with red armbands. They carried rifles that looked too heavy for their thin arms. An older sergeant, maybe 40, with an iron cross from the First War pinned to his threadbare tunic, approached Weber. "Major, we have orders to hold this intersection. How long should we expect to hold?" Weber looked at the boys behind the barricade, at their pale faces and frightened eyes, at the single Panzerfaust launcher propped against the tram, useless without a tank to shoot at, suicidal if there was. "As long as you can," Weber said, because there was no other answer to give. "The Führer is still in the city?" the sergeant asked. "The radio says he is directing our defense personally. He is still here. Then we will hold." The sergeant's voice carried the weight of a man who had survived one war and understood he would not survive this one. But his eyes said something else. They said, if the Führer stays, there must be hope. If the leader remains, there must be a plan. Weber wanted to tell him the truth. There was no plan. There was no hope. The Führer was not directing defense. He was issuing orders to divisions that no longer existed while Soviet tanks rolled closer every hour. Instead, he said, "Hold as long as you can, then fall back to the next intersection. Conserve ammunition." He returned to the bunker and wrote, April 21st, I went above today, saw the city we are defending, saw the boys defending it. 16 years old, Martin, children with rifles and one-shot anti-tank weapons, told to stop an army of 2 million. They asked if the Führer was still here. I said yes. They smiled. They think his presence means something. They think it means we can still win. I did not have the heart to tell them that his presence means nothing except that 300,000 people will die in a pocket that serves no strategic purpose. Tonight, the Field Marshal and Colonel General Fischer will make their proposal. I do not know what I hope for. If the Führer accepts and flees to Bavaria, he could rally SS fanatics and prolong the war for months. If he refuses and stays, everyone trapped in Berlin dies for nothing. There is no good outcome, only degrees of catastrophe. Martin, wherever you are, I hope you are far from this. April 22nd arrived with confirmation of what everyone in the bunker had known, but no one had acknowledged. The afternoon military briefing became the breaking point. Weber stood in his usual position near the door, notebook ready, as Colonel General Fischer delivered the operational summary. His voice was steady, professional, relaying facts that added up to comprehensive disaster. General Steiner reports his forces are insufficient to mount the requested offensive. Current strength is estimated at 5,000 personnel, no armor, limited artillery support, ammunition critical. Field Marshal von Stein, standing beside the map table, said nothing. The Ninth Army remains encircled south of Berlin near the Halby Pocket. Latest intelligence indicates the army has effectively ceased to exist as a coherent fighting force. Survivors are attempting to break out westward in small groups. Weber felt his throat constrict. The Ninth Army, Martin's army. Though Weber did not yet know it, his brother had already been dead for 6 days, killed in the initial bombardment that preceded the encirclement. But that knowledge would not reach him for another week, and until then, the hope that Martin might somehow have survived would drive every word he wrote. General Wenck's 12th Army has advanced to within 40 kilometers of Potsdam, but reports strong Soviet resistance. Wenck requests clarification of his operational objectives. Fischer paused. This was the moment. The moment when someone would have to say aloud what the numbers proved. There would be no relief, no rescue, no miraculous reversal. Adolf Hitler sat at the head of the table. His hands trembled continuously now, the tremor visible even at rest. His left arm hung limply. His eyes seemed focused on something beyond the concrete walls, some alternate reality where phantom divisions still marched to his commands. The silence stretched. 30 seconds. 45. No one spoke. Then Hitler erupted. The outburst lasted perhaps 20 minutes. Weber had witnessed angry speeches before, but this was different. This was not calculated rage designed to intimidate subordinates. This was genuine, volcanic fury mixed with something that sounded almost like despair. Betrayed by cowards, the SS has failed me. The generals have lied. The troops have quit. Everything I built, destroyed by incompetence and betrayal. His voice cracked. He slammed one trembling hand on the table. The war is lost. Lost. I will remain in Berlin to personally direct the final defense, and then I will die here among the ruins. If my generals and my soldiers have abandoned me, then I will show them how a leader faces the end. It was the first time many staff members had heard Hitler explicitly acknowledge defeat. The words hung in the bunker's stale air like a pronouncement of execution. Then as suddenly as it began, the outburst ended. Hitler sat down. The trembling in his hands increased. He stared at the map without seeing it. The room remained silent except for the steady rhythm of generators and the distant percussion of artillery. Von Stein and Fischer exchanged a glance. Then they withdrew, gesturing for Weber to follow. They climbed to the upper bunker level and found an empty storage room. Von Stein closed the door. For a moment, no one spoke. He has announced his intention to die here, Fischer said finally, which means he will trap 300,000 soldiers and civilians in a hopeless defense. Something must be done, von Stein replied. What can be done? We have no authority to countermand his orders. We have no forces capable of extracting him against his will. We can only ask, and asking may result in our execution for defeatism." Von Stein turned to Weber. "Your brother was with the Ninth Army." "Yes, sir. The Ninth Army no longer exists. I am sorry." Weber had known this was coming, had prepared himself for it. But hearing the words spoken aloud in this concrete room by a field marshal who never exaggerated or softened truth made it real in a way imagination could not. "I understand, sir. Do you want to be relieved of duty? Given leave to—" "No, sir. I prefer to remain." Von Stein studied him. "Why?" "Because someone should witness what happens here. Someone who understands what it cost." A long pause, then Von Stein nodded. "Tomorrow morning, Colonel General Fischer and I will propose to the Führer that he relocate to Bavaria. We will frame it not as retreat, but as strategic redeployment. The Alpine Redoubt, continued coordination of Southern armies, preservation of command authority." "He will refuse," Fischer said. "Probably, but we must try. If we do not try, and 300,000 people die in this pocket, we will bear that responsibility." "We already bear that responsibility," Fischer replied quietly. "We have borne it for 12 years. One more conversation will not absolve us." "No, but it may save lives." Fischer turned to Weber. "You will be present as witness. If this proposal results in our arrest or execution, you will document what was said and why. Understood?" "Yes, sir." "Then get some rest, Major. Tomorrow will be difficult." Weber returned to his quarters and wrote the longest letter yet. April 22nd. "Martin, they have confirmed your army is destroyed. I do not know if you are alive. I do not know if anyone from the Ninth escaped. The mathematics say you are dead, but I am not ready to accept mathematics. Tomorrow, Field Marshal von Stein and Colonel General Fischer will do something unprecedented. They will tell the Führer to leave Berlin, to save himself and perhaps save the rest of us. I do not think he will listen. Today he screamed that the war is lost and that he will die in Berlin. It was the first time I have heard him admit defeat. But admitting defeat and accepting the consequences are different things. If he listens and leaves, fanatic SS units will rally to him in Bavaria. The war could continue for months. More will die. If he refuses and stays, everyone in Berlin dies. But the war ends quickly. I do not know which outcome is worse. Both are terrible. Both waste lives. The only difference is how many lives and how much time. Tomorrow I will witness a conversation that should have happened 12 years ago. I will watch men who spent their careers obeying finally choose conscience over command. It is too late to matter. But perhaps it matters that they tried. Martin, if you are alive, I hope you are moving west. I hope you have dropped your rifle and your uniform, and you are walking toward American lines with your hands up and hope in your heart. If you are dead, I hope it was quick. I hope you did not suffer. I hope somewhere there is grace for soldiers who followed orders they should have questioned. Forgive me for not being braver sooner. Forgive all of us." He folded the letter and placed it with the others. 21 letters now. A chronicle of collapse written to someone who was almost certainly dead. But writing them kept him sane, and sanity in a bunker 50 feet underground while the world burned above was a precious commodity. April 23rd, 1945. Morning. Weber woke before dawn, though dawn meant nothing in the bunker where artificial light burned constantly and time was measured by briefing schedules rather than the sun. He dressed carefully as though preparing for an important ceremony. In a way, he was. He found von Stein and Fischer in the map room, surrounded by charts and intelligence reports. They had been there for hours preparing their case like lawyers, building an argument for a hostile jury. "The aircraft at Gatow," von Stein was saying, studying a typed report. 2 Ju-52 transports still operational. Soviet fighters control most of the airspace, but at night flying low, there is a possibility. 60% chance of being shot down, Fischer replied, but that is better odds than remaining here. And the ground option? Convoy southwest through Potsdam. General Wenk's advance elements have reached within 30 kilometers. If we move quickly, before the Soviet ring closes completely, a small convoy with heavy escort might break through. 40% chance. At best. They were discussing mathematics of survival for a man who had sent millions to their deaths. Weber found the clinical nature of the conversation almost absurd, but this was how professional soldiers thought. Reduce everything to numbers, calculate probabilities, present options. Von Stein saw Weber and straightened. Major, we will meet with the Führer at 1300 hours. You will bring the operational maps showing escape routes. You will stand in the corner and take notes. You will not speak unless directly addressed. Understood? Yes, sir. If this meeting results in our arrest, do not intervene. Document what happens. Survive. Tell the story. I will, sir. Fischer approached carrying a leather folder. I have prepared the tactical justification. Alpine Redoubt as defensive position. Continued coordination with Army Group South. Symbolic preservation of leadership. He must understand this is not retreat. It is strategic redeployment. He will call it cowardice, von Stein said. Then we must convince him otherwise. They spent the next 3 hours rehearsing. Who would speak first? How to present the maps. What words to use and what words to avoid. They practiced like actors preparing for a performance, knowing that the performance might end with their execution. At 12:30 hours, Weber returned to his quarters and wrote, April 23rd, in 30 minutes, I will witness something no one has witnessed in 12 years. 2 field-grade officers will tell Adolf Hitler to run. They have rehearsed their arguments. They have prepared maps and operational assessments. They have framed the proposal as strategy rather than survival. But we all know what this is. This is a last attempt at sanity in a place where sanity died long ago. This is professional soldiers rediscovering conscience when conscience can no longer change outcomes. Martin, I think about something Father said after the First War. The hardest thing for a soldier is knowing when to stop being a soldier and become a man. He meant knowing when duty requires disobedience, when following orders means surrendering your humanity. These men are trying to be men today, 12 years late, but trying. I do not know what I hope for. Every outcome is terrible, but perhaps it matters that someone tried. If I do not write again, know that I tried too, in small ways, in cowards' ways. But I tried. He folded the letter and placed it in his tunic. Then he collected the maps and followed von Stein and Fischer down the 18 stairs to the lower bunker level. The conference room was small, perhaps 4 meters by 5, with concrete walls and a single overhead lamp that cast harsh shadows. A map table dominated the center. Around it stood the instruments of a collapsing empire. Outdated intelligence reports, radio transcripts, casualty summaries that no one read anymore because the numbers had become meaningless. Adolf Hitler sat at the head of the table. He was 56 but looked 70. His face was gray. His hands trembled continuously. His left arm hung useless. When he looked up at the entering officers, his eyes seemed simultaneously focused and distant, as though he was seeing through them to some other reality where the war was still winnable and his decisions still mattered. Eva Braun, his longtime companion, sat in a corner chair, silent and watchful. She was 33, attractive despite the bunker's deteriorating conditions, devoted in a way that Weber found both touching and incomprehensible. She had chosen to stay when she could have left. Weber did not understand that choice, but he respected it. Von Stein placed the maps on the table. Fischer stood to his right. Weber moved to the corner, notebook ready, trying to make himself invisible. For a moment, no one spoke. The generators hummed their eternal rhythm. Somewhere above, artillery continued its methodical destruction of the city. Then von Stein began. Mein Führer, Colonel General Fischer and I have prepared an operational assessment of the current situation. With your permission, we would like to present our findings and recommendations. Hitler gestured vaguely. Permission or dismissal, Weber could not tell. Von Stein unfolded the first map. Berlin at the center, red arrows converging from east, south, and north. Soviet forces, each arrow marked with unit designations and estimated strength. Soviet forces will complete the encirclement of Berlin within 24 to 48 hours. Marshal Zhukov's 1st Belarusian Front from the east. Marshal Konev's 1st Ukrainian Front from the south. Approximately 2 million soldiers, 6,000 armored vehicles, overwhelming artillery superiority. He unfolded a second map. German positions, marked in blue. Scattered, isolated, shrinking. Our defensive forces within the Berlin pocket number approximately 300,000, including regular army units, Volkssturm militia, Hitler Youth formations, and administrative personnel. Ammunition is critical. Food supplies will last perhaps 1 week. No reserves exist. No relief operations are feasible. The trembling in Hitler's hands increased slightly. He said nothing. Fischer stepped forward, his voice clinical, professional. General Steiner's forces are insufficient for offensive operations. The Ninth Army has ceased to exist as a coherent unit. General Wenck's 12th Army is engaged with Soviet forces west of Potsdam and cannot advance closer to Berlin. He paused. This was the moment. The transition from assessment to recommendation, from reporting facts to suggesting action. Given these conditions, remaining in Berlin results in certain capture or death within days. We therefore recommend immediate relocation of command authority to a more defensible position where operational coordination can continue. Von Stein placed a third map on the table. Southern Germany, Bavaria, the Alpine region marked in green. Berchtesgaden remains under our control. The Alpine Redoubt offers defensive terrain, supply depots, and continued communication with Army Group South. From this position, command authority can be maintained, coordination of remaining forces can continue, and the symbolic leadership of the Reich can be preserved. Weber watched Hitler's face. No expression, no reaction. Just those distant eyes staring at maps that showed an empire reduced to a pocket of territory, growing smaller by the hour. Von Stein's voice grew quieter, more careful. Aircraft remain available at Gatow Airfield. Alternatively, a ground convoy could attempt to break through to General Wenck's positions southwest of here. The operational window is narrow but still open. Within 24 hours, that window will close. Fischer added the final piece. This is not retreat, mein Führer. This is strategic redeployment, preserving command authority to continue coordination, maintaining the symbolic leadership that inspires our soldiers to continue fighting. Silence. Long silence. Weber counted seconds. 30, 45, 60. Then Hitler stood. The movement was slow, almost painful. He placed both trembling hands on the map table and leaned forward, studying the charts as though seeing them for the first time. When he spoke, his voice was not angry. It was quiet, almost philosophical. And that made it more frightening than any outburst. "You want me to run?" Von Stein opened his mouth to protest. Hitler raised one hand, stopping him. "No, do not dress it in military terminology. Do not call it redeployment or strategic withdrawal. You want me to flee, to abandon Berlin, to leave while my soldiers die here, like the French generals in 1940 who abandoned Paris and called it strategy. Like all the cowards I defeated who chose survival over honor." He traced one trembling finger across the map, following the red arrows converging on Berlin. "If I leave, what happens to morale? If the Führer abandons the capital, why should any soldier continue fighting? The defense will collapse, not into organized retreat, into panic, into rout. Men will throw down their weapons and run, and they will die running, shot in the back by the enemy, or hanged by SS security for desertion." Von Stein tried again. "Mein Führer, your presence in the South could rally—" "Rally what?" Hitler's voice remained quiet, but now carried an edge. "Rally SS fanatics who still believe in final victory? Rally Hitler youth boys to die in mountain passes? Create a legend of resistance that inspires 50 more years of terrorism and suffering?" Weber realized something in that moment. Hitler understood exactly what von Stein was proposing, and he was rejecting it not because he misunderstood, but because he understood perfectly. "I built the National Socialist movement from nothing," Hitler continued. "I broke the Treaty of Versailles. I reclaimed the Rhineland. I unified Austria with the Reich. I launched the greatest military campaign since Napoleon." His trembling hands pressed harder against the table. "If I flee now, how will history remember me? Not as the leader who expanded Germany to unprecedented dimensions, as the coward who ran when his people needed him, as the dictator who sent millions to die but saved himself." Fischer, desperate now, tried a different approach. Mein Führer, if you remain here and die, the war ends quickly. If you establish yourself in Bavaria, resistance could continue for... I know, Hitler interrupted. That is precisely why I will stay. Weber stopped breathing. Had he just heard what he thought he heard? My presence here gives meaning to their sacrifice, Hitler said. My presence proves that the Führer did not abandon his people. And when the end comes, when Soviet soldiers fight their way down these corridors, they will find me here, dead, not captured, not fleeing, not begging for mercy. He straightened, looking at von Stein and Fischer directly. You think I do not understand what you are trying to do. You want to save me. Perhaps you even think it is your duty. But you are wrong. Saving me would prolong this war, prolong suffering, prolong the deaths of young men who have already sacrificed more than any generation should be asked to sacrifice. Weber's mind reeled. Was Hitler actually acknowledging that his survival would extend the war? No. Hitler's voice turned cold. I will remain in Berlin. I will direct the defense for as long as possible. And then I will end my life on my own terms, in my own capital, showing every German soldier how a leader faces the inevitable. Von Stein made one final attempt. Mein Führer, we could position this as, no. The word was final. Absolute. Not angry. Just final. You may go, Hitler said. You may relocate yourselves if you wish. Establish command posts outside Berlin. Coordinate whatever operations remain possible. But I will stay. Von Stein and Fischer stood frozen. 12 years of unquestioning obedience had trained them never to argue with a direct order. But this was not an order to advance or retreat or hold position. This was an order to accept his suicide, and by extension, the death of everyone trapped in the city with him. Fischer, in a moment of desperation that Weber would remember for the rest of his life, said something unprecedented. Mein Führer, if you stay and die, the war ends in days. Germany can begin to rebuild. But if you escape to Bavaria and rally fanatic resistance in the Alps, the war could continue for months. More will die. Civilians, soldiers, on all sides. Which option truly serves Germany? It was the first time anyone had framed Hitler's decision as a tactical choice rather than a moral one. Stay means quick end. Leave means prolonged suffering. Hitler turned to Fischer. For a moment, something passed across his face. Recognition, perhaps, or the ghost of the strategic mind that had once calculated military operations with cold precision. Then it was gone. Germany does not need me to survive. Germany needs me to demonstrate how a leader faces defeat, with courage, in his capital, not hiding in mountains like a bandit. He sat down, the trembling in his hands worse now. You're dismissed. Coordinate whatever operations you deem necessary from outside Berlin. But I remain here. Von Stein opened his mouth, closed it. There was nothing left to say. They saluted. Hitler did not return the salute. He was already staring at the maps again, seeing phantom divisions that would never arrive to break a siege that was already complete. Weber followed von Stein and Fischer out of the room. They climbed to the upper bunker level in silence, found an empty corridor. Stood there, three men who had just witnessed something unprecedented. He refused, Fischer said finally, stating the obvious because someone had to say something. He understood exactly what we were proposing, von Stein replied, and he chose death over survival, not because he misunderstood, because he understood perfectly. Did you hear what he said about prolonging the war? I heard. He knows that leaving would rally fanatics. He knows it would extend suffering, and he is choosing to stay because, Fischer trailed off, because his vanity will not permit him to be remembered as a coward, von Stein finished. But in choosing vanity over survival, he is accidentally choosing the option that ends the war faster. They stood in silence, processing this. Then von Stein turned to Weber. You witnessed? Yes, sir. Then document it. Write it down, because someday people will need to understand that we tried. We failed, but we tried. What will you do now, sir? I will travel to General Wang's headquarters, coordinate whatever resistance remains possible, perhaps help evacuate civilians westward, away from Soviet advance. It is pointless, but it is something. Fischer said, I will relocate to the north, maintain communications, pretend that military coordination still matters. Both men understood they were describing theater. The war was over. Their presence or absence would change nothing, but they would go through the motions because that was what professional soldiers did. Von Stein placed one hand on Weber's shoulder. You should come with me. Your brother is gone. You have no reason to stay. Weber thought about the teenage soldiers at the barricade, about the staff who would remain in the bunker, maintaining routines as the world collapsed, about witnessing the end. I prefer to stay, sir. Someone should see how it ends. Von Stein studied him for a long moment. You are braver than I am, Major. No, sir. Just more curious about whether history will remember us as cowards or fools. A ghost of a smile. Both probably, but write it down anyway. Maybe someday it will matter that we tried. They shook hands. Then von Stein and Fischer departed, climbing the stairs to ground level where staff cars waited to carry them away from the bunker they would never see again. Weber stood alone in the corridor. The generators hummed their eternal song. The ventilation system cycled stale air. Above him, the city died. Below him, the man who had killed it prepared his own death. He returned to his quarters and wrote, April 23rd, evening. Martin, they tried. Field Marshal von Stein and Colonel General Fischer stood before Adolf Hitler and told him to leave Berlin, to save himself, to preserve command authority, to continue coordination from Bavaria. He refused. But Martin, here is what you need to understand. He did not refuse because he misunderstood. He refused because he understood perfectly. He said that staying gives meaning to soldiers' sacrifice, that his presence proves the Führer did not abandon his people, that dying here creates a better legacy than fleeing to mountains. He said that if he fled to Bavaria, fanatic SS units would rally. The war would continue for months. More would die. And by staying, by choosing death over escape, he ends it faster. Martin, I watched a monster make a calculation, not a moral calculation, a vanity calculation. He is choosing death not to save lives, but to save his legacy. He wants to be remembered as the leader who fell with his capital, not the coward who ran. But the result is the same. By staying, the war ends in days instead of months. By refusing to escape, he saves lives he never intended to save. Is that justice? Is that redemption? No. He is still responsible for millions of deaths. He is still the architect of catastrophe. But in this moment, his worst quality, his vanity, produced an outcome better than the compassionate proposal of our generals. Von Stein wanted to save him. Hitler's refusal will save others instead. The general's mercy would have prolonged suffering. The dictator's pride will end it. History will say we should have stopped him years ago. History is right. But history will not record that at the very end, when we finally tried, our failure was better than our success would have been. That is the cruelest joke I have ever heard. Weber folded the letter. As he did, there was a knock on his door. Major Weber. He opened it. A medical orderly stood there, young, nervous. Sir, I have information about your brother, Corporal Martin Weber. Weber's heart stopped. The casualty lists from defensive operations south of Berlin are being processed. I saw your brother's name on the preliminary roster. He was reported killed in action on April 16th during defensive operations with the Ninth Army. The words came from very far away. Weber heard them but did not feel them. Not yet. Thank you for informing me. I am sorry, sir. The orderly left. Weber closed the door, sat on his bunk, stared at the 22 letters in his footlocker. Letters written to someone who had been dead since the first day. Letters written because the alternative was accepting reality he was not ready to accept. Then the orderly knocked again. Sir, I apologize. I was mistaken. There are 2 Martin Webers in the Ninth Army records. The one killed on April 16th was a different soldier. Your brother, Corporal Martin Weber from Stuttgart, is listed as captured by American forces on April 21st near the Halb Pocket. He broke out of the encirclement with a small group. Surrendered west of the Elbe. He is in an American POW camp. Weber stood. Are you certain? Yes, sir. I confirmed with the personnel office. Your brother is alive. The orderly left again. Weber sat down again, stared at the letters again. Martin was alive, had been alive this whole time, had escaped the pocket 3 days ago while Weber was writing desperate warnings to a ghost, was safe in American custody, probably eating Red Cross rations and wondering when he would go home. Weber had been writing letters to someone who did not need them, had been documenting collapse for someone who had already survived it. For a moment he felt nothing. Then relief crashed over him like a wave. Then something else. Something that felt almost like betrayal. He had stayed in this bunker because he thought his brother needed his witness, because he thought someone in his family should understand what happened here, and why. Because personal stakes made professional duty bearable. But Martin was safe. Martin had done what Weber had begged him to do. Moved west, surrendered to Americans, survived, which meant Weber's reason for staying was gone. He was documenting collapse not for his brother, but for history, not for personal redemption, but for abstract record-keeping. And somehow that made staying more important, not less. He picked up his pen and wrote a final section to the April 23rd letter. Martin, I just learned you are alive, captured by Americans on April 21st, safe in POW camp. I cannot tell you what that means to me. I have been writing these letters thinking you might be dead, thinking someone needed to know what happened here and why, thinking my witness served a purpose. Now I know you are safe, and I am still here, still witnessing, still documenting, but not for you anymore. For whoever finds these letters someday and asks the question, how did World War II end? The answer is complicated. It ended not when good defeated evil. It ended when evil defeated itself. Today I watched evil refuse salvation. I watched vanity accidentally save lives. I watched the worst man I ever knew make the best decision of his final year. For all the wrong reasons. That is how the war ends, Martin. Not with heroes, with villains choosing death over exile and accidentally shortening the suffering they caused. I do not know if that is justice, but it is what happened, and I am staying to witness the rest, not for you, for the record. So someday someone will understand that history is not a morality play. Sometimes the right thing happens because the wrong person makes the wrong choice for the wrong reasons. That is the lesson of April 23rd, 1945. The day Germany's generals told their Führer to run, and he said no, and more lives were saved by his no than would have been saved by his yes. Tomorrow the encirclement completes. In 7 days he will be dead. In 8 days the war will be over. Not because we stopped him, because he stopped himself. Your brother, Klaus. He placed the letter with the others. 23 letters now. A chronicle that had begun as personal testimony and transformed into historical record. Above him, the city burned. Below him, the generators hummed. And in 7 days, the man who had sent millions to their deaths would end his own life in a bunker beneath his capital. And the war would end not with triumph of good over evil, but with evil's spectacular self-destruction. Weber lay down on his bunk. He did not sleep. He thought about his father's words, about soldiers becoming men, about duty and conscience and the terrible moment when they conflict. Von Stein and Fischer had tried to be men. They had failed, but their failure was more valuable than their success would have been. That was the secret history did not teach. Sometimes failure is better than success. Sometimes the wrong outcome is the right outcome. Sometimes a monster's vanity saves more lives than a saint's compassion. Weber would witness the rest, would write it down, would survive to tell the story. And 74 years later, in a misfiled box in the National Archives, someone would find his letters and understand what historians had missed. The conversation of April 23rd was not a failed attempt to save Hitler. It was a successful demonstration that even at the end, even when too late, even when futile, speaking truth to power matters. Not because it changes outcomes, but because it proves that some men, however late, however inadequate, tried to be more than obedient servants of evil. They tried to be human, and their humanity, rejected and dismissed, mattered more than their success would have. That was the story Weber would tell. The story hidden in letters written to a brother who did not need them, discovered decades later by people who did. The generators hummed. The war continued. 7 days remained until the end. Weber closed his eyes and waited for tomorrow. April 25, 1945. The Soviet encirclement of Berlin completed at 15:47 hours when advance elements from Marshal Zhukov's 1st Belarusian Front met reconnaissance units from Marshal Konev's 1st Ukrainian Front near the town of Ketsin, 25 miles west of the city center. The steel ring was closed. 300,000 German soldiers and civilians were trapped inside, along with the man whose decisions had led them there. Weber updated the maps in the conference room. Red markings now formed a complete circle around Berlin. No gaps, no escape routes, no possibility of relief. He wrote, April 25th. The ring is closed. Martin, you escaped 3 days before it shut. 3 days. If you had stayed with your unit, tried to hold position as ordered, you would be trapped here now. Instead, you chose survival over duty. You chose correctly. The same day the ring closed around Berlin, American and Soviet forces met at Torgau on the Elbe River, cutting Germany in half. The Third Reich, which at its peak controlled territory from Norway to North Africa, from the Atlantic to the Volga, now exists only in scattered pockets that shrink hourly. I stood in the map room today and traced the borders of the empire we built. Then I traced the borders of what remains. The mathematics are brutal. We controlled 4 million square kilometers. We now control perhaps 40,000. A reduction of 99% in 5 years. That is not defeat. That is annihilation. That is the consequence of 12 years of decisions made by men who confused will with strategy and loyalty with wisdom. The Führer has not emerged from his private quarters in 2 days. Eva Braun remains with him. Goebbels drafts propaganda, communiques that will never be broadcast. Bormann maneuvers for position in a government that has ceased to exist. Staff officers maintain routines because routine is all that remains. We are ghosts performing rituals for an empire already dead. The bunker's atmosphere had shifted in the days since von Stein and Fischer departed. The pretense of military coordination had collapsed. No more briefings about phantom relief operations. No more orders to divisions that no longer existed. What remained was waiting for Soviet soldiers to fight their way through the final defensive rings. Waiting for the end. Weber spent hours above ground, documenting the street-level reality that bunker inhabitants could not see. The city was dying in sections. Some districts fought with desperate intensity, Hitler Youth and Volkssturm units contesting every intersection. Other areas had simply stopped resisting, white flags appearing in windows, civilians emerging from cellars with hands raised. He saw the teenage sergeant from the barricade again, the one who had asked if the Führer was still in the city. The sergeant was dead now, slumped against the overturned tram with 3 other bodies. They had held their position for 2 days. Then Soviet tanks had arrived, and holding positions became dying in them. Weber documented it in a letter written by flashlight in a basement that still smelled of cordite. April 26th. The boy who asked about the Führer is dead, 16 years old, killed defending an intersection that had no strategic value, following orders from a command structure that stopped functioning days ago. I think about what the Führer said. My presence gives meaning to their sacrifice. But does it? Did that boy die more meaningfully because the Führer was still in Berlin? Or did he simply die, and meaning is something we invent afterward to make the waste bearable? Martin, you are safe now. You will never have to answer that question. But I am here surrounded by people who believe their sacrifice had meaning, and I cannot escape the suspicion that meaning is just another casualty of this war. April 27th brought a radio message from General Walter Wenck, commander of the 12th Army. Weber was summoned to deliver it to the Führer's quarters. He knocked on the door. Eva Braun answered, her face composed, her dress immaculate despite the deteriorating conditions. She took the message and returned moments later. The Führer has read it. There is no response. Weber knew what the message said. He had decoded it himself. Wenck's army had advanced to within miles of Potsdam, the closest it would ever get to Berlin. But Soviet resistance was overwhelming. Wenck could not advance further. He recommended that any personnel wishing to escape attempt to break out westward toward his positions. The message was clear. There would be no relief. No rescue. The generals had kept their army mobile not to save Berlin, but to hold open escape corridors for retreating soldiers and fleeing civilians. Wenck had made his choice. save as many as possible by not throwing his army into an impossible battle. It was the right choice, and it meant everyone still in Berlin was on their own. That evening, Weber wrote about decisions and consequences. April 27th. General Wenck will not come. His message said what we already knew. There is no military solution, there is only time. How many hours until Soviet assault troops reach the government quarter? How many hours after that until they fight down the stairs into this bunker? How many hours we have left? The Führer is arranging his death. Eva Braun will die with him. Goebbels has decided his entire family will die here. His wife Magda agrees. Their 6 children, ages 4 to 12, will be poisoned because their parents believe death is preferable to life in a world without National Socialism. I am watching the end of fanaticism, not its defeat, its suicide. These people are not being killed. They are killing themselves because the alternative, living in a world they did not conquer, is unacceptable. Martin, you chose life. You chose correctly. Whatever judgment history makes of us, remember that you chose life when others chose death. April 29, 1945. Night. Weber sat in his quarters, listening to the sounds of battle filtering down from above. Soviet artillery, small arms fire, the crump of explosions. The government district was falling. Tomorrow or the next day, they would reach the chancellery. After that, hours, maybe less. He pulled out paper and began writing what he knew would be one of the final letters. But this one was different. This one was not a chronicle of events. It was an exercise in imagination, a thought experiment, an attempt to answer the question that had haunted him since April 23rd. What if the Führer had listened? April 29th. Martin, tonight I want to write something different. Not what happened, but what might have happened. Not history, but the history we avoided. Let me imagine April 23rd differently. Let me imagine the Führer accepted Field Marshal von Stein's proposal. Let me walk through that alternative timeline and see where it leads. Weber closed his eyes and began to construct the scenario. Not fantasy, not speculation, but careful extrapolation based on military reality and human nature. He wrote quickly, the words flowing, building 2 parallel timelines that would never meet, but whose contrast would reveal everything. April 23rd, evening, alternative history. The Führer agrees, reluctantly, angrily, but he agrees. Prepare the aircraft. We depart tonight. Staff scrambles. Essential personnel. Eva Braun, Goebbels, perhaps Bormann. A small convoy to Gatow airfield, driving through darkness while Soviet shells fall randomly on city streets. The Ju-52 transport waits, engines running. They take off at 0300 hours, flying low, hugging terrain, hoping Soviet night fighters do not spot them. 60% chance of being shot down, but in this timeline, they are lucky. They land at Berchtesgaden as dawn breaks on April 24th. News spreads. The Führer has relocated to Alpine Command. The propaganda machine, still functional in the South, spins the narrative. Strategic redeployment, continued resistance. The Alpine fortress will never fall. And here is what happens. SS divisions, perhaps 50,000 fanatics who still believe, rally to Berchtesgaden. Not because they think they can win, but because their Führer is alive, and alive means there is something to fight for. Berlin still falls. That does not change. But without the Führer's death to mark a definitive end, resistance does not collapse. It continues, fragmentary, desperate, but continues. In this timeline, I am given orders. Report to Bavaria. All available staff officers to help coordinate Alpine defense. I obey because that is what I have been trained to do. I travel south through chaos, somehow arriving. I am assigned to help organize supply lines for mountain warfare that can only end one way. May 1945, alternative history. American 7th Army approaches the Alps, encounters entrenched SS units who fight with suicidal determination. Mountain passes, fortified positions, every valley contested, every village a battlefield. American casualties, 500 per week initially, then 700, then 1,000 as fighting intensifies. Young men from Pennsylvania and Texas and California killed taking terrain that has no strategic value except that someone decided to defend it. German casualties, 2,000 per week, 3,000. Mostly SS fanatics, but also Volkssturm old men and Hitler youth boys sent to die in mountains because their Führer demands it from his Alpine headquarters. Civilian casualties. Worse. Villages bombed because they might shelter resistance. Reprisals for suspected partisan activity. Chaos as front lines shift. 2,000 per week. 3,000. Families who survived 6 years of war, killed in the final months because the war did not end when it should have. Weber paused, his hand cramping. He flexed his fingers and continued, the mathematics becoming clearer, more brutal. June 1945, alternative history. The fighting continues. Allied commanders grow frustrated. Intelligence agencies debate the use of atomic weapons. Weapons I do not fully understand but which rumors say are being developed on the Alpine Redoubt. Not because the Redoubt is a military threat, but because symbolic resistance inspires practical resistance elsewhere. While the Führer lives and broadcasts defiance from his mountain headquarters, other isolated pockets refuse to surrender. Commanders in Denmark, garrison forces in Norway, submarine crews still at sea, all clinging to the hope that if the Führer fights, perhaps something can still be salvaged. July 1945, alternative history. Psychological warfare intensifies. Leaflets drop daily. Radio broadcasts in German. Hitler is hiding. Hitler is a coward. The war is over. But photographs prove he is alive. Voice recordings, increasingly desperate, but unmistakably his, prove he is still giving orders. And as long as he lives, fanatics have something to die for. The mathematics become brutal. Each additional week of fighting produces predictable casualties. American forces, 800 to 1,200, depending on the intensity of operations and terrain. German military forces, 3,000 to 4,000, mostly SS and committed volunteers. German civilian population, 2,000 to 5,000, caught in combat zones or subjected to reprisal operations. Total per week, approximately 6,000 to 8,000 human lives consumed by a war that should have ended months earlier. August 1945, alternative history. Supply lines to the Alpine Redoubt finally collapse. No food reaches defending units. Ammunition runs critically low. The human cost of continuing operations becomes unbearable even for fanatics. Some units begin to surrender. Others fight to the death in their bunkers, choosing annihilation over capitulation. Weber stopped, did the mental arithmetic one more time to ensure accuracy, then wrote the conclusion. September 1945, alternative history. The Alpine Redoubt finally falls. Either through overwhelming assault or because supply collapse makes continued resistance impossible. The Führer is captured alive or commits suicide in a mountain bunker instead of a Berlin bunker. The method of his death does not matter for this calculation. What matters is the timeline. April 23rd to September 15th, 21 weeks of additional warfare. Multiply 21 weeks by average weekly casualties. The mathematics are straightforward. American forces, approximately 17,000 to 25,000 additional deaths. German military forces, approximately 63,000 to 84,000 additional deaths. German civilian population, approximately 42,000 to 105,000 additional deaths. Total range, 122,000 to 214,000 additional human deaths. For what purpose? For 5 months of futile resistance inspired by one man's refusal to accept defeat on April 23rd instead of September 15th. That is the cost of the Führer's survival. That is what Field Marshal von Stein's compassionate proposal would have produced. Not salvation, extended catastrophe. Weber set down the pen, staring at the numbers he had just calculated. His hand was shaking. Not from fear, from the clarity of what he had just understood. Then he picked up the pen again and wrote the second timeline, the timeline of what actually happened, the timeline that would make the contrast undeniable. April 23rd, actual history. The Führer refuses, says no, stays in Berlin. Von Stein and Fischer depart. The bunker continues its death watch. April 30th, the Führer commits suicide. Eva Braun dies beside him. Word spread slowly at first, then rapidly through radio intercepts and captured prisoners. By May 1st, every German unit knows. The psychological impact is immediate and total, not inspiration. Termination. The symbol is gone. The cause is dead. Fighting continues only where local commanders insist, and those commanders find themselves increasingly isolated as subordinates refuse to sacrifice themselves for a leader who is already dead. May the 2nd. Berlin surrenders. General Helmuth Weidling, the officer appointed to command the city's final defense, formally capitulates to Soviet forces. 130,000 soldiers enter Soviet captivity. A terrible fate awaits most of them. Years of imprisonment, forced labor, death from disease and mistreatment, but alive at the moment of surrender, not killed in futile street fighting for a bunker whose occupant was already dead. Alive with possibility, however slim, of eventual return home. May 7th, Admiral Karl Dönitz, the Führer's designated successor, surrenders unconditionally to Allied forces at Reims. Dönitz has no ideological commitment to continued resistance. He is a naval officer, practical, focused on the possible rather than the mythical. His priority is arranging surrender to Western powers rather than Soviets for as many German forces as possible. He succeeds partially in this aim. Forces in the West surrender to Americans and British. Forces in the East surrender to Soviets. The geography of surrender determines the geography of survival, but the principle is the same. The war is over. May 8, 1945. Victory in Europe Day. The war that began September 1st, 1939, ends after 5 years, 8 months, and 7 days. Not because good defeated evil in glorious battle, but because evil killed itself and its followers lost the will to continue without their symbolic leader. Weber wrote the final comparison, the conclusion that would define everything. Timeline A, alternative history, war ends mid-September 1945. Additional deaths beyond May 8th, approximately 152,000 to 214,000 human beings. Additional months of suffering, 5. Additional moral cost, unmeasurable. Timeline B, actual history. War ends May 8th, 1945. The Führer's refusal to escape on April 23rd results in his death April 30th, which results in German surrender May 7th, which prevents the 5 months of additional warfare that Timeline A would have produced. The mathematics are undeniable. The Führer's decision to stay, motivated entirely by vanity and narcissistic concern for his historical legacy, saved between 122,000 and 214,000 human lives. Not German lives specifically or Allied lives specifically, human lives. Lives that would have been wasted in 5 additional months of futile resistance in Alpine terrain. Lives of American soldiers who would have died taking mountain passes. Lives of German soldiers who would have died defending those passes. Lives of German civilians who would have died in the crossfire or in reprisal operations or in the chaos of extended warfare. All saved, not because the Führer intended to save them, but because his vanity made him choose the option that happened to cause less total harm. Weber paused, the weight of what he was documenting pressing down on him. Then he wrote the conclusion that would echo through history. Martin, do you understand what I am saying? Field Marshal von Stein tried to save the Führer's life. The Führer refused. And by refusing, the Führer saved more lives than von Stein's mercy would have saved. The general's compassion, their belated attempt to preserve their leader's life, and perhaps their own consciences, would have resulted in Timeline A. Extended war, extended suffering, an additional 150,000 to 200,000 deaths, using the midpoint of the range. The Führer's vanity, his narcissistic refusal to be remembered as a fugitive, his insistence on dying heroically in his capital, resulted in Timeline B. Quick end, less suffering, fewer deaths. This is not redemption. The Führer is still responsible for tens of millions of deaths over 12 years. He is still the architect of the greatest catastrophe in human history. He is still evil incarnate. But on April 23, 1945, his worst quality, his all-consuming narcissism, accidentally produced a better outcome than the compassionate proposal of our most senior military commanders. That is the ultimate irony. That is the secret hidden in these letters. That is what historians missed because they focused on what happened instead of what did not happen. Field Marshal von Stein told the Führer to run. The Führer said no, and his no saved 100,000 to 200,000 lives that his yes would have cost. Not because he intended to save lives, not because he suddenly developed compassion or moral clarity, but because vanity made him choose the option that happened to cause less harm than the alternative. That is how World War II ended, not with heroes making noble choices, but with a villain making a vain choice that accidentally shortened the suffering his own decisions had caused. Is that justice? No. Is that redemption? No. Is that what happened? Yes. And that is the story I'm writing for you, Martin. For history. For whoever finds these letters and asks the question, how did the war end? It ended when wrong defeated itself. When evil's internal logic demanded a conclusion that served humanity better than humanity's efforts had served itself. Tomorrow the Führer will die. In 7 days the war will be over. Not because we stopped him, because he stopped himself. And in stopping himself quickly rather than slowly, he accidentally did less harm than he would have done by surviving longer. That is the lesson. Not a comfortable lesson. Not a morally satisfying lesson, but a true lesson. Your brother, Klaus. April 30th, 1945. Afternoon. The final letter was brief. Weber wrote it in hurried handwriting, knowing Soviet troops were fighting through the government quarter less than 400 meters away. April 30th, approximately 1500 hours. It is ending now. The Führer and Eva Braun have retreated to his private suite. Staff has been informed. We wait in the corridor. Goebbels, Bormann, myself, others. The sound of artillery is constant now. Small arms fire echoes down the stairwell from ground level. I do not know what happens next, whether we surrender or fight or die. I do not know if these letters will survive, if you will ever read them, if anyone will. But I needed to finish the chronicle, needed to document the final hours, needed to record what happened here so that someday someone might understand. The conversation of April 23rd was not a failed attempt to save Hitler. It was a successful demonstration that even at the end, when too late, when futile, speaking truth to power matters. Not because it changes outcomes, but because it proves some men tried to be more than obedient servants. Von Stein and Fischer tried to save him. He refused. His refusal saved others. That is the story. That is what happened. Now I wait for a gunshot, then I wait for whatever comes after. The letter ended there. Weber did not sign it. He placed it with the others in his footlocker. 47 letters chronicling the collapse of the Reich and the conversations that determined how quickly that collapse became complete. At 15:30 hours, a single gunshot echoed through the bunker's concrete corridors. Staff members waited for several minutes, the sound hanging in the stale air like a final punctuation mark on 12 years of catastrophe. Then aides entered the Führer's suite and found what everyone had known they would find. Adolf Hitler's body slumped on a sofa, gunshot wound to the right temple, pistol on the floor. Eva Braun lay beside him, dead from cyanide poisoning. Weber was not among those who entered the suite. He stood in the corridor, listening as others confirmed what the gunshot had announced. Then he watched as the bodies were carried up the emergency exit stairwell into the Chancellery garden, moving past him like shadows in the artificial light. He did not go above ground. He sat in his quarters and thought about mathematics. Timeline A versus timeline B. The lives saved by a decision made for entirely wrong reasons. The accident of history that produced less harm than intention would have produced. That night, as Soviet forces tightened their grip on the government quarter and the sounds of battle drew closer with each passing hour, Berlin's remaining defenders began surrendering in larger numbers. The symbolic center was gone. The reason to fight had evaporated. What remained was survival, the basic human calculus that transcended ideology and duty, and all the abstractions that had kept them fighting. Weber survived, captured by Soviet troops on May the 2nd when they fought their way into the bunker complex, descending the 18 stairs he had climbed so many times, finding the staff and secretaries and guards who had maintained routines until routine became impossible. 8 years in prisoner of war camps in the Soviet Union followed. Hard years. Hungry years. Years when survival was not guaranteed and death from disease or mistreatment or simple despair took men every week. But he survived. Released in 1953, one of the last prisoners to return home, he found himself in a Germany that barely resembled the nation he had left. Divided now, occupied, reduced, ashamed. He found Martin in Frankfurt that same year. His brother had been released from American custody in 1946, had rebuilt his life with the pragmatism of a man who understood that survival required moving forward, had married, had children, had created something new from the ruins of what had been destroyed. They stood on a train platform in the rebuilt city and embraced for a long time without speaking. Two men who had survived different versions of the same catastrophe, reunited by chance and persistence, and the simple mathematics of not dying when so many had. Later, over dinner that neither of them ate much of, their appetites stolen by emotion and memory, Weber gave Martin the letters. All 47 of them, carefully preserved through 8 years of Soviet captivity, wrapped in oilcloth, protected from moisture and time, in the thousand small violences of imprisonment. "I wrote these to you," Weber said, his voice quiet in the restaurant that was too loud with other people's conversations and laughter, that felt alien to men who had learned to live in silence. "But they are not really for you. They are for history, for whoever needs to understand what happened and why." Martin read them over several weeks, sitting in the apartment he had rebuilt, his wife and children respectfully quiet as he absorbed words written by a brother he had thought lost, chronicling events that had determined whether both of them would survive. When he finished the final letter, when he understood the full scope of what Weber had documented and calculated and preserved, he asked the question Weber had been asking himself for 8 years. "Should we publish them?" Weber thought about it, staring out the window at a Frankfurt that bore no resemblance to the city he remembered from before the war. Everything rebuilt but different, scars hidden but still present beneath the new construction. No, not yet. Someday perhaps, when enough time has passed that people can read them without rage overwhelming analysis. When enough distance exists that people can see the irony without feeling like the irony diminishes the evil or excuses the catastrophe. "When will that be?" Martin asked, and Weber heard in his brother's voice the same uncertainty he felt about whether such a time would ever arrive. "I do not know. Maybe never. But keep them. And when I am gone, if you think the time is right, give them to someone who will understand what they mean. Someone who will see what I saw. That sometimes history is saved not by virtue but by vice. That sometimes the right thing happens for all the wrong reasons. That sometimes we survive not because of heroes, but because villains defeat themselves in particular ways at particular moments." Weber died in 1987, aged 74, his heart simply stopping one night as he slept. A peaceful end that felt almost unearned after everything he had witnessed and survived. He had lived a quiet life after his return, worked as an accountant, married late, had no children, never spoke publicly about his war service or the letters he had written in a bunker beneath a dying city. The letters sat in a drawer in his apartment, and after his death, Martin donated them to the National Archives with minimal documentation. Just a brief note. Personal correspondence, World War II, Berlin 1945, from Major Klaus Weber to his brother Martin. They were filed, then misfiled. Box 247, miscellaneous Wehrmacht correspondence. A clerical error or simple bureaucratic chaos meant they were placed with routine military documents instead of being flagged for historical significance. They sat there for 31 years, untouched, unread, waiting. 2019, Washington, D.C. National Archives. Sarah Mitchell was 28, a research assistant working on her doctorate in European military history, specifically the final months of the Third Reich and the decision-making processes of senior military commanders. She was cataloging misfiled documents from post-war donations, a tedious process that usually yielded nothing interesting, just routine paperwork that had been incorrectly sorted decades earlier. Box 2047 contained the standard material she had seen in hundreds of other boxes. Requisition forms for supplies never delivered. Personnel transfers for units that no longer existed. Casualty reports listing men whose bodies were never recovered. Then she found the letters. 47 envelopes, tied with string that had gone brittle with age, carefully preserved despite the decades. German text, Wehrmacht stationery, dated April 16th and 30, 1945. She opened the first one with the careful respect due to fragile historical documents and began reading. 6 hours later, she was still reading, her other work forgotten, her lunch appointment missed, her phone silenced. She had forgotten everything except the voice of Major Klaus Weber, writing in real time as the Third Reich collapsed around him, documenting conversations that historians knew about but had never understood correctly, calculating timelines that revealed ironies no one had seen. She called her advisor, Professor David Hartman, her voice shaking with excitement. "I found something. You need to see this. Today. Now." The verification process took months. Handwriting analysis comparing Weber's letters to known samples of his signature and writing from personnel files. Paper dating using chemical analysis to confirm the documents were created in 1945, not fabricated later. Cross-referencing with known historical records, checking every date and name and event mentioned in the letters against established timelines and archives. Everything checked out perfectly. The letters were genuine, written by a real person, documenting real events, offering a perspective that existing histories had missed entirely. Publication in 2020 caused a sensation in academic circles, though the broader public paid less attention, distracted by contemporary crises and lacking the historical context to understand why these letters mattered so much. But among historians who specialized in this period, the Weber letters forced a fundamental reconsideration of April 1945 and the conversations that determined how the war ended. Not because the letters revealed new facts. The timeline was known. The events were documented in other sources. Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel and Colonel General Alfred Jodl, the real names behind Weber's von Stein and Fischer, had testified about these conversations at Nuremberg. But Weber's real-time chronicle, his calculation of the alternative timeline, his understanding of what did not happen and why it mattered, showed something historians had missed. The conversation of April 23rd was not a failed attempt to save Hitler. It was an accidental referendum on how wars end. And Hitler's refusal, while motivated entirely by vanity and narcissistic concern for his legacy, accidentally saved more lives than his acceptance would have saved. The implications were profound and deeply uncomfortable for historians trained to think in terms of clear moral categories and straightforward cause and effect relationships. Good intentions leading to worse outcomes than bad intentions. Professional soldiers showing more compassion than their monstrous leader, but their compassion would have extended the suffering they were trying to end. A dictator's vanity accidentally serving humanity better than humanity's attempts to show mercy to that dictator. It did not fit clean narratives. It did not allow for simple moral judgments or satisfying conclusions. It forced historians and readers to confront the reality that history is not a morality play, where good choices lead to good outcomes and bad choices lead to bad outcomes, where heroes act heroically and villains act villainously, and the results align with our moral expectations. Sometimes, rarely but undeniably, the wrong person makes the wrong choice for the wrong reasons, and fewer people die because of it. That was what the Weber letters proved. That was what made them important. That was what made Sarah Mitchell call her advisor at 9 o'clock on a Tuesday evening and insist he come to the archives immediately, despite his protests about dinner plans and early meetings the next morning. Professor David Hartman had spent 40 years studying the Third Reich's final days, had written 3 books on the subject, had interviewed surviving witnesses and examined thousands of documents. The Weber letters forced him to reconsider everything he thought he understood. He wrote the introduction to the published collection, and his words captured what made these letters historically significant beyond their documentary value. For decades, historians have analyzed the events of April 1945 through a simple lens. Hitler refused to leave Berlin, therefore more people died in the final defense. The moral calculus seemed clear. If only he had left earlier, if only he had surrendered sooner, if only someone had convinced him to step down, suffering would have been reduced. Major Weber's letters force us to confront an uncomfortable alternative. If Hitler had left Berlin on April 23rd, as his generals proposed, as professional military judgment recommended, As simple compassion for the trapped population might have suggested, the war might have continued for months, not because Hitler was militarily capable of reversing German defeat. The outcome of the war was determined. German surrender was inevitable, but because Hitler's survival would have inspired continued fanatical resistance in terrain that favored defense over offense, in mountains where small numbers of determined defenders could exact horrific casualties from attacking forces. The Alpine Redoubt, though largely mythical in terms of actual prepared fortifications and supply depots, was real as a psychological concept. SS units would have rallied to a living furor. Hitler Youth formations would have died in mountain passes for a leader who was still giving orders. American casualties would have mounted week after week in operations that served no strategic purpose except eliminating resistance that existed only because its symbolic leader had not yet died. The war that ended May 8, 1945 might have extended to September or October, consuming thousands more lives every week in a futile defense that could not change outcomes but could extend suffering. Hartmann's introduction continued, building the argument that Weber had first articulated in a bunker beneath Berlin while the city burned above him. Weber's letters document not just what happened, but what did not happen. And understanding what did not happen is essential to understanding why April 23rd matters more than we realize. Field Marshal Keitel and Colonel General Jodl, professional soldiers showing belated compassion after 12 years of complicity, tried to save Hitler's life. They presented a rational argument for escape, preservation of command authority, continued coordination of military operations, strategic redeployment to defensible terrain. Their proposal was militarily sound, personally compassionate, and would have been catastrophically wrong in its consequences. Hitler refused their proposal. His refusal was motivated entirely by vanity, by narcissistic need to control his own narrative and legacy, by inability to accept the image of himself as a fugitive hiding in mountains while his capital fell. He chose death in Berlin because he believed, correctly, that dying in his capital would create a better historical image than fleeing to Bavaria. But the outcome of his vanity, the consequence of his narcissistic calculation about legacy, was less human suffering than the outcome of Keitel and Jodl's compassionate proposal would have been. This does not redeem Hitler. Nothing redeems Hitler. His responsibility for the deaths of tens of millions over 12 years is absolute and damning. His crimes are among the worst in human history. But it does complicate our understanding of how this specific part of history unfolded, how the war ended, and what role individual decisions played in determining the pace and scope of that ending. The generals tried to do the humane thing by their limited understanding of what humanity required in that moment. The dictator refused for inhuman reasons, for reasons rooted entirely in self-image and historical vanity. And the dictator's inhuman refusal accidentally produced a more humane outcome, measured in lives not destroyed, than the general's humane proposal would have produced. That is the lesson of the Weber letters. History is not simple. Good intentions do not guarantee good outcomes. Evil intentions do not guarantee the worst possible outcomes. Sometimes, not often, but sometimes, we are saved not by human virtue, but by the specific nature of human vice, by the particular way that evil defeats itself when its internal logic demands conclusions that serve humanity better than humanity's conscious efforts serve itself. Hartmann concluded his introduction with a direct address to readers that echoed Weber's own understanding of why these letters mattered. Hitler's vanity made him refuse escape when escape was still possible. That same vanity made him choose death over prolonged fugitive existence. And that choice, made for entirely self-serving reasons, shortened the war by months and saved between 100,000 and 200,000 lives that would have been consumed in continued Alpine resistance. For families of American soldiers who died between April 23 and May 8, 1945, this is cold comfort. Their loss is absolute, their grief undiminished by calculations about alternative timelines. For families of soldiers who would have died between May 8 and September 1945 in the timeline that did not occur, this is the difference between grief and survival, between a father who came home and a father who did not, between existence and non-existence for children who were born because their father survived. Weber understood this with painful clarity. He calculated it in real time. He documented it for future generations. And he left us these letters so that someday, when enough time had passed, when enough distance existed, we might understand that wars end not when good defeats evil in satisfying narrative arcs, but when evil defeats itself through its own internal logic and contradictions. That is what happened April 23, 1945. That is what the Weber letters prove. That is what we must understand if we are to understand how World War II actually ended, not how we wish it had ended or how simplified versions tell us it ended, but how it actually ended in all its moral complexity and historical irony. For Americans reading this, especially those over 60 whose fathers or uncles or older brothers served in World War II, the Weber letters carry particular significance that goes beyond academic historical debate. Many of your fathers fought in Europe in April 1945. Some of them died in those final weeks, killed in combat that occurred between Hitler's refusal to escape and Germany's final surrender. If Hitler had accepted Keitel's proposal on April 23rd, fled to Bavaria, established himself in the mountains, some men who came home from the war might not have. They might have died in July or August taking Alpine passes, fighting against SS units that rallied to a still-living Führer. But some who died between April 23rd and May 8th might have lived longer if the war had ended sooner through Hitler's earlier death or capture. The mathematics are cold and impersonal. The reality is warm and deeply personal. Your family history might have been different. Your existence might depend on decisions made in a bunker beneath Berlin by men you never knew. For reasons that had nothing to do with you or your family, in a conversation about whether a dictator should flee or stay in a city that was about to fall. Klaus Weber survived 8 years in Soviet captivity through a combination of luck, constitution, and will. Returned home to a divided Germany that bore little resemblance to the nation he had served. Lived quietly, worked as an accountant, never spoke publicly about these letters because he believed the time was not right, that the wounds were too fresh, that people needed more distance before they could see the irony without feeling that the irony diminished the evil or excused the catastrophe. Martin Weber survived American captivity with far less hardship, released in 1946, built a family, raised children, lived to see his grandchildren. His children and grandchildren live in Germany today. They have read these letters. They understand that their grandfather survived because he chose life over duty at a critical moment, because he moved west instead of east when his unit was shattered, because he surrendered to Americans instead of fighting to the death or being captured by Soviets. They understand that their existence depends on one man's choice to disobey orders and survive rather than obey orders and die. The brothers reunited in 1953 after 8 years of uncertainty and separation. Klaus gave Martin the letters on a train platform in Frankfurt, 47 envelopes that contained a chronicle of collapse and a calculation of alternative timelines. Martin kept them for 34 years while Klaus lived, respecting his brother's wish to wait for the right time, for the moment when publication would enlighten rather than inflame, when the irony could be understood without feeling like justification. After Klaus died in 1987, Martin donated them to archives where they sat misfiled for 31 years until Sarah Mitchell, cataloging routine documents on a Tuesday afternoon in 2019, found something that made her forget lunch and dinner and everything else except the voice of a man writing 74 years earlier about conversations that determined how many people would live or die in the war's final months. The letters are now available in full translation, academic editions with extensive footnotes in historical context, public editions with introductions that explain the significance for general readers. Digital archives where anyone with internet access can read Klaus Weber's chronicle of the Reich's final days and the conversation that determined how quickly those days would end. What you will find if you choose to read them is not a story of heroes or villains in simple categories that allow for easy moral judgments and satisfying conclusions. What you will find is a story of men who tried too late to do the right thing for complicated reasons, and a man who did the wrong thing for wrong reasons that produced an outcome that saved lives precisely because wrong defeated wrong in a particular way at a particular time, in a particular place. That is history, not the clean version taught in elementary schools where heroes are heroic and villains are villainous, and the outcomes align with moral expectations. The messy version that actually happened, where good intentions fail because the world is complex and consequences are unpredictable, where bad intentions accidentally succeed because evil contains its own contradictions, and sometimes those contradictions produce results that serve life over death even when that was never the intention, where the only lesson is that human affairs are more complicated than any moral framework can fully capture, any narrative can completely explain, any judgment can definitively assess. The Wehrmacht officers who told Hitler to run were not heroes. They were accomplices waking up 12 years too late to their complicity in crimes and catastrophes. They were professionals finally remembering that professional competence divorced from moral judgment produces monsters rather than opposing them. Hitler was not a tragic figure whose final decision redeemed anything. He was a criminal whose vanity accidentally limited the damage his survival would have caused. He chose death in Berlin not to save lives but to save his legacy, to control how history would remember him, to die heroically rather than live as a fugitive. The outcome was not justice, it was not redemption, it was accident. The accident of vanity conflicting with survival instinct in a way that produced less harm than survival would have produced. The accident of narcissism demanding a heroic death that shortened war rather than a cowardly escape that would have prolonged it. And sometimes, in history, that is the best we get. Not justice, not redemption, not moral clarity, just accident that favors life over death, survival over catastrophe. Even when the living and the dead do not know that accident has occurred, even when the alternative timeline exists only in calculations written by a man in a bunker who understood what historians would miss. Klaus Weber knew this. He calculated it while Soviet troops fought their way closer to the bunker. He documented it in letters he could not send. He preserved it through 8 years of imprisonment. He entrusted it to his brother with instructions to wait for the right moment. And 74 years after the last letter was written, we can read his words and understand what he understood in April 1945. Wars end not when good defeats evil in satisfying climactic battles. Wars end when evil defeats itself through internal contradictions, when vanity conflicts with survival, when narcissism demands conclusions that accidentally serve humanity better than conscious, moral choice serves it. And sometimes that self-defeat, accidental and unintended, motivated by the worst human qualities rather than the best, saves more lives than any act of heroism or virtue or moral courage could save. That is the story of the Weber letters. That is the story of April 23, 1945, when 2 generals told their Führer to run, and he said no, and his no saved 100,000 to 200,000 lives that his yes would have cost. That is the story of how World War II ended, not with triumph of good over evil, not with heroes making noble sacrifices, not with villains receiving just punishment, but with exhaustion, with mathematics, with accidents, with evil defeating evil in a way that accidentally favored survival over death. The right thing happened, for the wrong reasons, by accident, through vanity, because one man refused salvation, and in refusing it, saved others he never intended to save. That is history, messy, uncomfortable, true, and that is why these letters matter, because they teach us that sometimes we are saved not by virtue, but by vice, not by courage, but by vanity, not by wisdom, but by accident. And we should be grateful for that salvation while never forgetting who made it necessary in the first place. What crimes preceded that moment of accidental mercy? What catastrophes created the context where a dictator's death saved lives his survival would have cost? The bunker is gone now, demolished in the years after the war, filled with rubble, paved over, covered with parking lots and apartment buildings. No marker exists at the site, no memorial, no tourist destination, just erasure, deliberate and complete, reflecting a broader German understanding that some places should not be preserved, that certain legacies deserve oblivion rather than memorialization. But the letters remain. 47 documents written by a man who did not know he was recording one of history's great ironies. Letters written to a brother who did not need them because he had already escaped and survived. Letters preserved for 74 years until the right person found them at the right time and understood what they meant. And now we know. We know what happened April 23rd when two generals proposed escape and a dictator refused. We know what did not happen in the months that followed. We know what the difference meant, measured in lives that were not destroyed, families that remained whole, futures that became possible because a war ended in May instead of September. 100,000 to 200,000 lives saved by accident, saved by vanity, saved by a monster's refusal to be saved. That is how the story ends. Not with heroes saving the day through courage and virtue, with accountants calculating timelines decades later, with historians revising narratives they thought they understood, with families reading letters and discovering that history is stranger and more complicated than any fiction could capture, than any moral framework can fully explain, than any simple narrative can adequately convey. Klaus Weber spent the rest of his life after returning from Soviet captivity wondering if anyone would understand what he had witnessed, if anyone would see the irony he had seen, if anyone would calculate the mathematics he had calculated, if anyone would recognize that sometimes the right thing happens for all the wrong reasons, and we should be grateful while remaining aware of what made it necessary. 74 years later, we understand, we see, we calculate, and we realize that sometimes, just sometimes, the universe operates according to principles more complex than good and evil, right and wrong, hero and villain. Sometimes wrong defeats wrong. Sometimes vice accidentally serves life. Sometimes narcissism produces outcomes that compassion would have prevented. And we call that history, and we study it. And we are grateful for the accidents that favored survival, while never forgetting why those accidents were necessary, while never excusing the crimes that created the context, while never redeeming the criminals whose decisions, made for terrible reasons, accidentally produce less terrible outcomes than the alternatives would have produced. That is the lesson. That is the story. That is what the Weber letters teach us about how World War II ended and what it means to understand history as it actually unfolded rather than as we wish it had unfolded. And that is why they matter. The letters are real. The irony is real. The mathematics are real. The alternative timeline that did not occur was real in its possibility, even if it never became actual. History is not what we wish it was. History is what happened. And what happened in April 1945 was stranger, more ironic, more morally complex than anyone knew until a research assistant found 47 letters in a misfiled box and read them and understood that she had discovered something that would change how we understand one of the most studied moments in human history. Until now. Now we know. And knowing changes everything.